Anyways, if you're a part of any subculture, or know someone who is, or are part of the subculture specifically, or just an alternative person in general, then you may know of these two subgroups. Punks, the loud, aggressive, music-thrilled, mosh-pitting community, and the floral-loving, dancing-in-the-wind, music festival-driven hippies. But did you know that these two subgroups don't actually get along all that well? So I looked into the history of both of these subcultures and how they developed and why they developed and the people that were a part of these subcultures when they developed, all the way up to their modern equivalents and their modern day communities. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to present that information to you, and you can talk about it, I guess. I don't know. Just don't be a dick about it. That's really all I ask. Before we get into this video, I am going to put some disclaimers real fast. 1. I am a punk. So I do have a foot in this fight. I do my best to present an unbiased opinion, but if you feel that me explaining this as a punk and talking about this argument is not okay, then that's fine, and you can stop watching. Thank you for watching thus far. I greatly appreciate it. 2. Most of my research are from articles that I have found, so if they describe the subgenre or the subculture or something about that subculture that you don't really, like, care about or, like, don't like the description of, don't get mad at me, please. I'm just reading from my sources, which are all linked down below. So, yeah, just please don't be mean. I'm a sensitive person. Great. Now that we got the intro and the disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's start with the first people on the scene, the hippie movement. There were some elements that were the forefront of the hippie movement at the time. These influences were the Beat Generation and Ken Kinsley and the Merry Pranksters. The Beat Generation was a short-lived counterculture that was a social and literary movement. They were a group of writers and poets who rejected the frigidity of American society at the time. They were also very anti-war, anti-establishment. They used the word hip vocabulary that often derived from jazz and that type of lingo and that type of sound. Other elements of them were sex and Zen Buddhism. They followed the ideology of spiritual enlightenment, self-discovery, sexual exploration, as well as self-discovery through heightened states of mind. Pretty much they were just drugs, sex, and jazz. Ken Kinsley and the Merry Pranksters is actually a really interesting story, but I don't have the time to talk about that, so I'm just going to give you a brief summary and how they influenced the hippie movement. Ken Kinsley was an American author who was very successful at the time and had a lot of money, wealth, and free time. So one day, him and his friends decided that they wanted to explore the world and see things that they hadn't done before. They often didn't consider themselves hippie because they felt they were a little bit too old for that. One day, with the help of Ken Kinsley's success and money, him and his friends decided that they wanted to have some self-exploration and rediscover America. So, him and his friends got a bus and decorated it in very bright colors and very interesting pattern making, and took a lot of drugs to have a heightened state of mind while rediscovering, traveling, and, you know, discovering themselves in the world. This all takes place around 1964-ish, and this specific influence was to kind of influence more drug use into the hippie movement and more the brightly colored and swirly, interesting patterns of that style at the time. Another obvious factor into the hippie movement was the Vietnam War. At a time where you literally had two options as a male in America, you were whether to be drafted in the war and more likely die because you are freshly 18 and have not had any life experience and now are being thrown on a battlefield, or going to college, because if you went to college they didn't draft you because you were a student. So you can kind of see where that anti-war comes from into the hippie movement. And honestly, I don't blame them, because even once you got out of school you still had a possibility of being drafted. So there was really no way of getting around this war. If you were a male, you were going to be drafted. Now that we got some prehistory and some influence out of the way, let's go ahead and get back to our original timeline of about 1960s, 1970s. The hippie movement started around the 1960s, mostly around or on college campuses. So if you have a crazy uncle who's just like, college will make you a liberal, it's probably because he had a girlfriend that became a hippie. Was that a good joke? I don't know. The movement was a result of the youth at the time being upset and unsatisfied about the modern-day society in a post-war America. The 1960s was pretty much the general society rules of the time were to settle down and go back to heteronormative, simple lives, having kids, getting married, having a job, and as well having a large pride in your country and in your work and in your government. General, what you would think of a nuclear family dynamic. Obviously, the youth felt that this was too controlling and too demanding, and so they said no. Thank you. And due to this youth generation at the time being baby boomers, like they are literally the baby boomer generation, this hippie movement and hippie idea sprang out very quickly at a very rapid rate because there were just so many people who didn't like post-America 1960 society and its rules and demands. There is one important aspect that is to be known about the hippie movement, is that it is kind of a class thing. It's mostly middle and upper class white people running away from society and pursuing other means of self-discovery and self-identity. The reason why I brought this up is because in the 1960s there was also another movement happening called the Civil Rights Movement. So that means that people of color who were ostracized and kept out of society were trying to become a part of society. Upper middle class white kids and 20-year-olds were leaving society behind. Hippies rejected all mainstream society. Materialism and consumerism were big time no's for them, so their lifestyle of living off the bare minimum was a very noticeable trope. Most people literally just left with what they had on their backs. This helped to create a lot of communities and communes within the hippie movement, which doing this helped to bring out more DIY type stuff where it was making your own clothes, growing your own garden. Most were vegetarians, but generally they were eating crops that they grew and getting clothes that they made themselves and getting their supplies and shelters from their own people within the community. So it brought a lot of helping your neighbor type of personalities and being a part of a community that supports one another. In these communities and lifestyle, it was obviously encouraged individualism and self-expression. It encouraged more sexual exploration for yourself and who you want to be and what you want to be, that you don't have to be confined to what a male-dominant society thinks you should be. I didn't put this in my script, but I feel like it is something that is important because when a lot of people bring up hippies, they obviously think of cults. Personally, I just think it was evil people taking advantage of really nice people. It happens a lot. I don't think the hippie movement influenced large cult activity. Obviously there was a spike, but it was more just young people who were easily manipulated and wanted to get away from mainstream society, and then very manipulative evil people taking advantage of those people. And of course we can't look past the free love movement that spawned through self-discovery and sexual exploration. They usually practiced with non-monogamy and queerness, and so it helped to add a lot of diversity within that type of environment. Unfortunately, some people use it as an excuse for not consensual things. So that's a thing. There was also a spiritual side to the hippie movement, looking into other forms of spiritualism, and self-spiritualism and discovery were big parts of it. Most of the spiritual aspects involved Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. You know, Eastern philosophy. Like Russia. That was a joke. It was mostly like Hinduism, Buddhism, obviously, astrology, and Romani spiritualism and practices like that. But speaking of Russia, obviously the 1960s was still kind of a hype for the Red Scare, and though a lot of politicians and normal day society considered hippies to be a bunch of communists, you didn't actually have to be political to be a hippie. That wasn't part of the philosophy or ideology. You just kind of, you didn't have to be. If you were, you would be considered maybe a yippie. Yes, it's an unfortunate name, YIPPEI, which just means Youth International Party. They were the more political hippies. If you know anything about the Chicago 7 trial or that type of protest, those would be more people who were political hippies. But you didn't have to be a political person or have a political voice to be a hippie. Aspects of the hippie movement that we're all aware of is the fashion and the music and the drugs. Hippies obviously wore clothes that were very baggy and loose-fitted, very handmade as well, that didn't really hug the silhouette. It was a very gender-neutral outfit. Men could wear skirts, women could wear skirts, women could wear pants, men could wear pants. Everyone grew out their hair, men grew out their facial hair a lot. And also the clothes were very brightly colored and very intense to look at. So very much the opposite of what a normal day 1960s, it's about 1960s society would look like. Obviously the hippie movement influences more 1970s fashion, but that's a later down the line issue. And obviously we do know the term boho, and if you listen to any Romani voice or content creator, which you should, by the way, you should listen to Romani people. A lot of the style is based on the general silhouette of the Romani people. Music was also a huge part of the hippie movement. Rock and roll and folk music were the main factors into the music genre of the hippie movement. Music festivals were obviously a way for the hippie movement and the people within the hippie movement to come together and communicate, intermingle, discuss, and just talk about things they enjoy while listening to their favorite bands and listening to some of their favorite music and just dancing and having a great time. Also doing so many drugs. If you know anything about the hippie movement and its history, then you know about the Summer of Love, which took place about 1967, which was a worldwide for the majority English-speaking world, so Europe, America, and Canada, music festival. This wasn't just a music festival as well, it was also a social and political event, so people who had political voices within the hippie movement could get their voices out and talk about issues like anti-war and climate and taking care of the world and industrialism and, you know, all that fun stuff. Another known festival is Woodstock, or the original name being Aquarian Explosion, 3 Days of Peace and Love. It was one of the largest music fests at the time, so much so that the city almost shut it down because they were having overpopulation issues and sanitization issues. I've already talked a little bit about drug use in the hippie movement, but let's just go ahead and do like a more concise discussion of it. Hallucinogenics were hot on the scene at this time. We even had the FBI testing LSD and drugs like that. So hallucinogenics were a way for many people to explore their spiritual side or have a self-discovery and kind of just not only explore the world around them, but the universe and themselves. So to kind of end off the hippie history, we're going to talk about some of the subcultures that developed due to the hippie movement. We have the visionaries, who were the people who follows the original kind of philosophy of the hippie movement. Freaks and heads, which you may have heard the term from your very conservative grandfather, which were the hippies that took a lot, and I mean a lot of drugs. Like a lot of drugs. They were also pretty spiritually driven as well, so that's why they took a lot of drugs to get to that heightened state of mind. Plastic hippies, who were posers. They're just posers. That's all they are. They're posers. They're people who just kind of like the hippie movement due to like the fashion and the music. They don't really care about anything else. And like I mentioned before, the yippies, who are people who were more political and actually had a political voice within the hippie movement. Now, of course, hippies didn't call themselves hippies, as it was a derogatory term at the time. They mostly called themselves love or flower children. Now, at the end of the hippie movement, these are ways that kind of slowly killed off the hippie movement, is one, it became really trendy and really popular to be a hippie around the 1970s. So a lot more people kind of made it become more mainstream, which if you know anything about like a subculture becoming mainstream, it gets polluted very quickly by people who don't actually understand the subculture. So it kind of slowly dispersed a lot of the hippie movement and made it more not as appealing to a lot of people as it used to be. As well, towards the end, a lot of the communities that were made and developed by hippies slowly became very poor and not economically sound, which when you don't really work in a capitalistic society makes sense. It sucks, but it makes sense. So a lot of the communities became very poor and very undeveloped and became very crime-ridden. I'm also not gonna say that it's possible that the American government maybe did some propaganda and had some influence in making these communities poorer and more crime-ridden and gave them a bad rap. Because it wouldn't be the first time. It's not probably going to be the last time. But, you know, I'm not saying that. Now, would you believe me if I told you that the punk movement was a direct reaction to the hippie movement? Well, you better, because it is. Alright, let's talk about the punks. The punk movement started in the UK about the 1970s to 1980s. The word punk was actually a prison slang. Some trivia for y'all. And it started as an underground music scene. So if anybody tells you you cannot be punk without listening to the music, that's true. Because this subculture was developed and founded by the music at the time. And even still has very heavy ties to the music. It is a music-based subculture. So you have to listen to the music to be punk. The music is described as rock and roll, but kind of more sped up with more emphasis on aggressive and loud vocals and more aggressive guitar. As well, the lyrics and the topics were very much influenced by the Dadaist movement, specifically Hugo Ball's poetics and spoken word performances. Quick little prehistory about Dadaist. Dadaist is a art movement that some would consider pre-punk. It is a rejection of modern day society at the time. It was very much more chaotic and illogical. It included more like brutal things. It was a more emotional response to things. They wanted to get people angry. It was a very spoken word and poetic form of art. There was also other forms of art, but most people know it for its poems and its theatrical performances. I learned all this in visual history too, by the way. Thanks, Brian. He knew I was doing this video. Alright, let's circle back to the punk movement. We're going to kind of stick with the music for a little while, and obviously you'll see the sentiments from the music into the movement. The music was very more aggressive and had a lot of political messages and pretty much gave a big fuck you to the establishment and a lot of the politics at the time. The bands that were kind of the main founders and kind of the establishing music of the punk movement were the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the X-Ray Specs, the Wire. That's all I wrote down. There's other ones obviously, but those were the main general ones that I put down on my list. Now, what is, like, punk as in the movement? Punk is a movement that just rejects modern day society and government. You know, we heard the song and dance before. But instead of, like, escaping from society and running away from the restraints and restrictions of society, it's more of an urban and city-based rejection of modern-day society. It's more about reclaiming the city and taking back and calling out the issues that are causing corruption and destruction within your city and within and to your people. Much like the hippie movement, it was a youth-driven group focused on self-discovery, self-exploration, a lot of sex, rock and roll. Punks support local business, and that they kind of go to smaller businesses to try and give them more stuff instead of, you know, supporting the big man in the office. This helped to support the punk movement and ideology of shopping local and shopping small, and even creating your own things to not support the establishment. Fashion elements for the punks that also were influences were Malcolm McLean and Vivienne Westwood. If you look at any of those fashions now, you can obviously see it involves a lot of layering, it involves a lot of fun different textures, a lot of fetish wear, lots of leather. You kind of see where it's going, patchwork, pins, accessorizing. The style also included a lot of androgynous, avant-garde, loud, and shocking looks. They also used political symbols as kind of like another factor for like shock value and aesthetic. Some of these symbols aren't great, obviously. The main majority of the symbols being anarchy, Marxism, Nazi stuff. Don't worry, it does bite the punks in the butt. Having Nazi affiliated things doesn't do great for the punks. Also, another similarity to the hippie movement was a lot of punks were vegans and vegetarians. I guess you just don't want to support big meat, which is fair. And plus you can grow your own crops, so yeah, it makes sense. But unlike hippies, there was a subculture that developed within the punk movement and due to the punk movement called straight edge, which if you don't know what that is, it pretty much is just people who don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't partake in any type of drugs, anything that can get them out of the influence. They sometimes even don't really participate in sexual needs or sexual influence, stuff like that. Which sounds fine if you're not a dick about it. Unfortunately, a lot of them are. Subgroups that were formed were the Oi, which were people who were more involved in street politics. Skinheads, which are often associated with neo-Nazis, because they usually are neo-Nazis. Anarcho-punks, they're just the very political punks, like very aggressively political punk. Afro-punks, which is a subculture created by the black community so then they can experience punk within a safe environment. Because I'm sure as you've checked out through my little history, there's a lot of racism within the punk community. Alright, yeah, it's time. Alright, let's talk about the Nazis and the racism. Punks played a lot with, like, you know, controversial imagery, and as well, it was a very loud and aggressive and semi-violent movement. People with more conservative point of views who really didn't have any trust in their government, which is fair, but also were just kind of upset and angry about the world, I guess, because, you know, no one hugged them enough as a kid. I don't know. Saw the Nazi symbols and the loud and aggressive and violent entire thing of the punk movement and was like, hey, that sounds cool. And so it influenced a very strong white power movement and neo-Nazi culture within the punk movement. These people also took the shock value and the violence and the very much aggressiveness of the movement and took it in a completely intense direction that was not well liked between the majority of the punks. And it wasn't only like they were a threat to the people around them, they were also a threat to the punk community itself. There is an article that I've starred down below that does a really good job at interviewing punk band members, and they talk about their neo-Nazi experiences at venues. The Nazi punks would come in and they would just cause pure havoc and destruction in the venue with no care for anybody else. A lot of their things was the, you know, mosh pit incidences where, if you don't know what a mosh pit is, it is something that happens at rock and punk and, you know, other music genres like that, where you're in a giant circle with people, or you, like, face off somebody, or whatever you want to do, and you literally just kind of charge off towards each other and bounce off each other and, like, kind of jump around and bump each other about. It's generally a, minus the description, a pretty safe thing to do at a punk event. Because if they see someone you're injured or you've fallen, someone will pick you up and get you out of there. If they see that you're not doing well or that you're a kid especially, they will not have you involved in that because it's a very, obviously, can be dangerous. You can get bruised up if you're not careful. The punk Nazis didn't care about that. They just wanted an excuse to beat the living shit out of some people. So they would, you know, make walls of death and just fucking charge at people and, like, start fights within mosh pits. They also would cause, like, injuries and assault and harass and even destroy property and injure people of the band and, like, their entire group of people there who were working for the band. So these punks were not punks. Let me say this, Nazis are not punks. They're fucking idiots, and I hate them all. Sorry, I got a little passionate there. There were elements that did come from Nazi punks, you know, taking over venues. It obviously led to the song Fuck Off Nazi Punks. Pretty killer song. It led to Rock Against Racism. It led to the Punch Nazis movement, which you should definitely do. Punch Nazis. And also, it created Lace Code. If you don't know what Lace Code is, it's a way for punks to identify other punks and people within the community. Lace Code is debated on the internet a lot. So I'm not really going to get into that. Here are just some general rules. I will say Lace Code only applies for combat boots and specifically Doc Martens, but any combat boot is fine. So lace and lace code is specifically the color of the laces and what they mean. Black is the standard, so it has no affiliation with anything, so you don't gotta worry about that one. Yellow means anti-racism, purple means gay, blue means you killed a cop, white means white power, and red means neo-Nazi. So don't put white or red laces on. And if you haven't killed a cop, don't put blue on. So punk never really died off, no matter what people say. It just kind of like dispersed into different subgroups and subgenres of music and stuff. So it's still around today, and it does typically try and follow the modern day ideologies of punks. It just is a slightly different message and slightly different sound, like pop punk. Speaking of the modern day, welcome to 2023. Let's talk about the modern day equivalents of both of these subgroups. So I'm gonna be so real right now. It was so hard for me to find any real articles on modern day hippies. A lot of them were 10 questions to realize if you're a hippie. Do you know if you're a hippie? Is your soul a hippie? Those type of things, which aren't really the articles I'm looking for. I'm looking for, you know, articles that will tell me what a modern day hippie is or a neo hippie is. There is one article that I'm basing a lot of my research on, which I've started down below, that did a really good job in my opinion. It's written by a woman who was raised by hippie parents from the actual hippie movement, and she talks with people who were also raised in that type of environment, and how they think modern hippies are different and similar to the original hippies. So again, that article is started down below. I really recommend reading it. It's a really, really good article. So the article and the general idea of a modern hippie and what they think of a modern hippie is unfortunately not great, as it kind of doesn't really follow the hippie movement's original lifestyle. Though it is great for young people to explore the world and have self-discovery and step away from the constricting world of society and give back to nature and stuff like that. A lot of the modern day hippie movement isn't really that. Being a hippie has always been a luxury. As I mentioned before, it was a middle to upper class white people thing, and that is still a thing today, as it costs money to travel and it costs money to go to the music fest. It's not like you can just leave everything behind and go out into the wilderness. Now, I'm not saying you can't. It's not like an everyday person can really just give up all of life and just go out into the wilderness and figure things out. Now, some people can, and that's fine. But generally, it is kind of a luxury to be able to do that. As well, in modern day society, we have a lot more infrastructure and a lot more private properties and stuff like that. So it's really hard to kind of go back out into the world and into nature and just thrive off that and make your own communities and make your own society without, one, paying a lot of money, or two, just straight up trespassing, or getting arrested, or all three, who knows? And as well, of course, if you're on the internet and you've seen anybody who identifies as a hippie or has somewhat of a hippie lifestyle or fashion, you know this because they're on the internet all the time, which, if you think about it, kind of goes against disconnecting from society. You know, the Instagram models and the family vloggers, you know the ones. And of course, we need to talk about one of the biggest elephants in the room for the hippie movement and neo-hippies, is that it's largely based in cultural appropriation. Even in our Lord 2023's year, we still have people wearing indigenous headdresses, we still have people using Buddhism and Hinduism as an aesthetic instead of, you know, an actual religion and philosophical practice. And of course, we cannot forget the boho style, literally originating from the Romani people and the Romani culture. More frequently, people using it as a way of an aesthetic and a look, instead of actually looking into the culture and the heritage and listening to the people of these communities. Now again, if you are someone who generally wants to help the world and you want to go and give back to nature and grow your own crops, and you don't like general everyday establishment in society, and you look into and listen to the voices of communities that are unlike your own and buy from those local communities, and even buying from indigenous Romani, then that's all in good. There is nothing wrong with that, and that is always encouraged. Then again, I'm a white person, so if someone tells me otherwise, listen to that person and not me. Our world is dying. We need people to want to help the world and make it better. There's nothing wrong with that. And if that's what makes you identify as a hippie, that's awesome. And I'm very, very happy for that. If you are someone who is in the hippie movement and you kind of just like it for the aesthetic and you like to vlog and you generally don't listen to minority voices or buy from minority communities or really actually understand the nature of taking care of Earth and the political climate of the world dying, then don't be a hippie. Don't. Just don't. Please? We're done talking about hippies. We're gonna talk about punks now. The main factor with modern day punks that differentiate from original punks is that it's no longer just about giving the finger to the man. It's a more worldwide political voice. They're speaking on issues of climate change, classism, gay and trans rights, police brutality, anti-racism, and the corruption within the government and businesses and literally anything within modern society that it can and is easily corruptible. With thanks to the internet, the punk movement and having political voices is so much easier now. Obviously, you can find more communities and you can learn more about political issues and discuss those political issues and hear from different communities. It's also an easier way to call out these issues and make a statement and even actually do something in politics. The internet has made life so much easier for punks and the political movement itself. It has also made DIYing and knowing how to make your own stuff a lot easier. As obviously you can listen to people who like craft and have ways of making things that are, you may not know how. The internet also makes it so much easier to know and find local small businesses. Again, those of them can be internet-based, but hey, you're still supporting local small business, and that is the whole part of the punk movement, is to support small and local businesses. But the internet is a rose, and thus every rose has its thorns, unless you buy it from a store where they cut the thorns. The internet is scary, and is run by capitalistic scum. The main element is supporting local business, obviously. This becomes a little bit harder in modern day society, because one, a lot of them are monopolized. Because big corporations make big boy money, and if you're a small business, it's kind of hard to compete with them a lot of the time. And as well, unless you live in a very localized area, it's really hard to find small business and local shops. For me, I live in Memphis, and most of Memphis is literally interstate and highway. And if you know anything about racial politics, then you know why, but that's another discussion for another time. So I have to drive like 30 minutes to go to any small local business, but then I have to make sure that I like that small local business, they are getting opinions or ideologies that I don't agree with, and then of course I gotta hurt my tank, and that means I gotta support big gasoline, right? I'll use the internet, but that means I'm gonna use the internet, and you have to support Comcast, Wi-Fi, and my Wi-Fi is made by a big company, and I don't want to support that big company, but it's the only big company I got. And then I go on a search engine that of course has unethical things happening all the time, but it's the only search engine that is useful, but then I also don't like the algorithm because then it gives me ads, and I don't like those ads, but then I go and shop on a store, like maybe Etsy, but then I find out that Etsy has, and then what if I buy from a small business, but then I find out it's a dropshipping business. That's not great. And then I find out they get their source unethical. And you see where I'm going with this? Because to be punk, you have to shop smart. And in a modern day society, it's a lot harder to shop smart. Because everything is owned by big boy business. And big corporations. And the government. And as well, something about punk and punk fashion is that it is very marketable. It sells so well. The elements of it are obviously accessorizing. You can sell those all separate. Obviously some main factors of punk is denim and leather. Those two things will never go out of style, and you can put a very high price on both of those materials. Now obviously you can work around this by doing the good old, if it's a chain it's free game, if it's small biz stay away. So you know. If you know, you know. And obviously punk, with it being trendy, means it gets invaded by posers all the time. Oh, and there's still a lot of racism. I didn't mention that part yet. Yeah, no, the punks still have a lot of racism in the community. It's a minority, but it's a very loud minority. Punks are already loud, so when we have a minority, they're already going to be louder. Which is super annoying. Alright, well, I made this, by the way. Look at this. Are you proud of me? That's it. That's really all I got. That's all the information I've collected. And now I've given it to you, the viewers, the audience, the commenters, to do whatever you feel like you want to do with it. I don't know. Use it at trivia night or something. Well, I guess just do all the dumb YouTube stuff, and thanks for watching. I gotta piss. Bye.